So when we had talked about this session, it was great to be able to bring together such an esteemed panel. And I think one of the framings that came up, and I certainly want to commend Samantha for thinking about the kinds of framings that we could possibly put together. Part of the discussion was, great, another panel on climate change. What are we possibly going to say that hasn't been said already? Do we really need to spend more time talking about the problem? Like, it seems pretty obvious what the challenge is. So then the conversation needs to shift to, great, so why is it that we haven't seen the kind of changes that we all clearly want to see, that we all clearly feel that we need to see, and to be able to move into a different space as people that clearly share an urgent desire and need to feel that the future can and must be different. And then to be able to think about that at different levels. So of course, how is it that we are cooking with certain ingredients? What are the recipes that we see that clearly are working? And then how do we find ourselves in the space to be able to take responsibility for what it is also that we've been cooking up. So my hope is that everyone, including everyone who's joining us, has the chance to reflect on that and to feel a little bit differently, and hopefully to engage in a little bit of a conversation that could be slightly different. So this is going to be a number of chefs being asked not to cook potentially in ways that maybe feel comfortable or that we're possibly used to, but intentionally trying to stir the pot, if you will. And again, going to see how long we can keep the food metaphors going, but we're gonna try to keep doing that as much as we possibly can. So I think initially we had talked about sort of these recipes for change that have no flavor, that was sort of a framing. Of course, we're seeing lots of recipes that are causing harm. I suppose one thing I'd like to jump into, and again, I'm going to jump around a little bit on some of these questions. So what are the ingredients that we need to create new recipes? When we talk about real and substantive change, or the opportunity for change to emerge, what are those real new recipes? And again, thinking about the types of ingredients that we need to have in those recipes, I think is really quite critical. So if we are discussing the opportunity for real change, I suppose that would be my first question to the panel, is what are the ingredients that we really have to create, that we need to have to create new recipes so that next year we're not having the same panel again on climate change and saying, woe is me, we're still dealing with exactly the same problem in exactly the same way. And some might say that 5 years ago we had possibly the same conversation, and hopefully 10 years from now we're not having the same conversation. So that's sort of the initial opening. The provocation is, what ingredients do we have to create those new recipes? Do you see real and substantive change emerging? And if you do see real and substantive change emerging with regards to climate, yeah, where is it? What does it look like? Would love to open it up and see who wants to start us off.
I'd like to start, John. I have a problem with the language we use. And I think the moment we switched from the term global warming to the more innocuous term climate change was disastrous, because I think it's put us in a direction and on a page which right at this moment is the wrong page to be on. And I refer to the focus that everyone has, governments, and the COP26 is going to be exactly the same on reducing emissions, which in the long term is very, very important indeed. However, the immediate problem is heating. And so the immediate emergency is methane and the greenhouse gases that even now from leakage, from burning fossil fuels, leakage, from waste, and from industrial agriculture, those three particularly, and the latter being about 40% of the total, that we need to do something about is being totally ignored. So I think the use of the language to direct our attention to something which, yes, is important and needs to be done, but is not immediately urgent, is very, very important for us to talk about.
Thanks, Richard. Let me come back to you a little bit. Within the context of what you've framed, clearly the shifting and the kinds of language and the narrative discourse, and we've even more recently seen climate emergency arrive as a framing. But where's the change and the real substantive sort of new ingredients in that? Do you see that there is something different, that there is pushback to climate change as a term? That do you think climate emergency is enough? Where do you see as the change in that discourse, as you're pointing out, that you think potentially leads to real change?
I think, again, there are good intentions probably, and a shift to those kinds of terms like climate crisis, climate emergency. But again, on the ground, in practical terms, it's all very well to shoot for theoretical targets and have 2030 or 2050. They mean nothing to people on the ground. So I'll give you a very practical example. How do we expect the energy companies like Shell, BP, Exxon to shift their attention and their resources and their capital, even though the threat of stranded assets hangs over their heads like the sword of Damocles? How do we actually expect them to shift while the conditions in which they operate, as in growth, competition, return to shareholders, haven't changed? What we need to do is create, for example, every country has a reserve bank. What we need to do is to create a carbon bad bank, for example, that can buy those stranded assets from those companies. Governments mandate a period of non-competition so that they can get their act together around clean balance sheets, and then come back to compete once again on innovating in the renewables space. But none of those practical things are happening. It's all theory, it's all talk.
Thanks so much, Richard. Yeah, it's sort of like we're asking the addict to stare in the mirror and keep changing themselves, but not providing the conditions for real dynamic change. Realizing that, again, if the incentives aren't there, if the support isn't there, that we're just expecting change where it's simply not possible. Let's keep it going. Others, Peter, Samantha, Sheila.
Yeah, can I just come back to the metaphor that you were trying to keep with John? One of the things that I think, if you're looking at, there's been a whole shelf of best-selling recipe books, but all of them are actually sponsored by companies which support continuous economic growth. And that's where all the recipes are coming from. There are very few recipe books on the shelf which don't have that as an underpinning or written into almost every recipe. And it's like, if you wanted to say it's something like sugar, which is in there, there is an addiction to something. The economic growth is what we're addicted to in terms of the diet. And for us to actually change the sorts of things which Richard is talking about, it's almost like we have to have therapy to get off the addiction. How does that happen? It means that maybe, we've got all the ingredients, I think. It's actually how we actually reconfigure them, which is, I think, what I was hearing from Richard. But there is this dominance of most of the recipes which we're getting fed, or the ones we're buying into, have this very dominant theme within them, and they're the ones that most people are buying into. We need to have another set of recipe books which are not overpowered by that addiction. Back to you, John.
Also, John, the translation, I think Peter is absolutely spot on. The translation by people of my generation, particularly industrialists, billionaires, and the people in power, the incumbent leaders, if you like, at the moment, are not getting out of the way fast enough for the younger generation, whose future it is, to actually have their input. And that concerns me immensely. The fact that the World Economic Forum, for example, or the the Business Council in the UK use weasel words just to manipulate people's psychology around what they're doing disturbs me, because all they're saying in both instances is profits still matter and that will still be our driving force, and the environment, well, to hell with it.
John, I think keeping with your metaphor, I think we have too much dependence on the cooks. You know, why not? Why don't we look at those who need to eat the food? You know, those who are people on the ground who will be experiencing, who are actually experiencing all of these extreme weather events and other, effects of the climate crisis. And I think it's not enough what we are doing to really empower the people on the ground. I think we have had a lot of decades on dependence on the so-called experts, and they haven't really offered any real solution. They have offered solutions. It's not happening on the ground, but the communities that are really actively working on the issues that they are facing, on their communities directly, they are able to address it. Just for example, the Keystone Pipeline, the people there, the indigenous peoples, in solidarity with activists worldwide. These are really very impactful work, and we cannot discount the ability of people to really drive change if we just allow these spaces for change. So I think total dependence on the cooks, I think that has to change. Of course, definitely you need to change the recipe. You have to change the recipe if you listen to people who are going to eat the dish.
Thank you all. I don't think we're looking deep enough. So if the question is, what is the crisis? I don't think the climate crisis is our crisis. I think our crisis is a moral, a spiritual one. And this is about our cultural evolution. So I think the sugar we're addicted to is a lot deeper than economic growth. We're addicted to narcissism. We're addicted to egotistical hierarchy. This is something that arises from our civilization of separation, from the first time that people decided, oh, let's get all these plants and plant them in the same place. And that way we can make surplus. And with surplus, we can have people who are not farmers, who are disconnected from the land, etc. So this is what I'm talking about, our civilization of separation. And so to this, it's a whole series of recipes, isn't it? We can talk about our industry of neoliberal optimism, for example, with the Hopi conversation. We can talk about late stage capitalism. We can say it's industrialized globalization. We can talk about patriarchy, white supremacy within our global and state institutions. We can say it's unmitigated urban growth and their efficiency at rapidly draining rural resources. We can say it's European colonization and world domination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can say it's the invention of the corporation, particularly that of the MNC. We can say it's the invention of the state. We can say it's the agricultural revolution, it's civilization itself. All these things are built upon one another. They interdepend. It's our dominant cultural evolution that's making us unwell. This is what I'm talking about when I point to our moral crisis. This is thousands of years in the making. So I'm pointing to how we come to hold the worldviews that we currently hold. And when we talk about sustainability and regeneration, we have to understand how we came to this point in the first place and why we intend to perpetuate this eco-fascist idea of so-called, this Western ideal of progress, of development, which is some kind of weird mishmash between philanthropy, charity, and some kind of global empowerment agenda based on poverty porn. I don't think we're asking the right questions here, that's all.
I can't agree more. Absolutely. For me, this crisis of consciousness, actually, because when I look around at how we think and what we continue to do, it's as though we've come to a threshold. We're in a gridlock of actually not being conscious of how to deal with exactly the problems Samantha is talking about. I would add, apart from separation, also this notion of exceptionalism, which we think we're the superior species, and that, as we see with the pandemic, that's a huge problem for humanity. We have to transcend those kinds of crises, the moral crisis, the crisis of consciousness, but we tend not to do that in practical terms because we just continue with what we've always done.
So let's keep this thread going with, are we in fact talking about the right problem, and how is it that we can find ways of confronting and unpacking, as Samantha and others have alluded to, which is that the complexities of this, what we're seeing at a very scientific level, which is increased carbon emissions, again, speak to broader and deeper and more systemic and clearly endemic challenges. And I'm reminded as well with this framing of one of the earliest pieces that I had read that really opened up a different purview, which is a piece by a historian, Lynn White, who in 1967 wrote about the historical roots of our ecological crises and talked specifically about the kinds of worldviews and the kinds of sort of separation between, let's say, or the idea of human versus nature. And it's quite interestingly that it was in 1965, so just a few years around the same time, that the first sort of report around carbon pollution landed on the US president's desk. So, in that exact moment, we see this opening up and this possibility. So does the conversation need to be then also about the forces that are actively sustaining that separation? So of course, we're seeing this crisis, and it's a crisis of consciousness, but we're seeing, sort of forces at work, right? The forces to sustain. So I would like to also think about that as well. Are we looking to fight fire with fire? And we clearly have seen movements like Extinction Rebellion say, no, wait a second, enough. The time has come for radical disruption. The system needs to be stopped. And to Sheila's point around, sort of pipeline, what we've seen happen as well, like, okay, we need to actively stop this. So are we at a point now where the only viable solution becomes this sort of, wake up aha moment? Because I suppose another metaphor, and I'm going to try to make it a cooking metaphor, I'm not sure if it's possible, is this sort of extracting people from the matrix type of moment, right? That now all of a sudden it needs to be that sort of radical and waking up that comes with potentially trying something new, a radically different flavor for the first time. So again, if there's that feeling slight of discomfort, or a feeling slight of, and this is more broadly, feeling like, wait, what exactly are we talking about here? Then I think that's okay, because I think actually holding that discomfort and leaning into it is the only way to really think about, what that crisis at that individual level, at that societal level, at that civilizational level sort of feels like. So again, to throw that back to the panel, how is it that we engage and combat with those forces that continue to deploy a variety of ingredients and recipes to sustain those systems at different levels that are clearly perpetuating the crises?
John, I think we cannot solve the problem with the same mentality, that caused to create this problem. So when we are talking about this separation, this entitlement, this exceptionalism that Richard mentioned a while ago, I think let us look at ourselves as activists, as people working on the ground, as academics. Are we really, looking at this as a problem, as our problem, as our responsibility? Are we, just relegating this to the academic discussions and theoretical discussions? Are we looking at, how we live our life on a day-to-day basis? Are we changing our life because we understand the gravity of the problem? So I feel quite frustrated when environmentalists are not shifting to veganism because, what is the moral authority of activists in saying that this is a crisis and we have to deal with it right now, and yet not doing the easiest thing to do, which is, addressing something that they could, directly control and then directly manage. This is not to discount the importance and the critical importance of working collectively. Definitely not. But I do think that if people who are really influential in the field are changing themselves, like what Al Gore did when he shifted to veganism. He was always being criticized about the ranches, and when he shifted, people saw the sincerity, and a lot of people, I would say, I'm in the movement with him, also shifted to veganism because they understood the urgency. This guy who is the loudest voice in the civil society is doing this, and this should happen. So are we detaching ourselves from our own responsibility? Are we just telling the cooks, do it yourself, that is your problem, that is your concern? Definitely it is their problem. And this, when we say anthropogenic climate change, it's unfair to people who did not contribute to this. But then how are we exactly working on it on a day-to-day basis? That is a question for me.
Yeah, look, I'm just struggling a little bit about, we're having very deep and strong discussions around this, and yet I think Sheila's just touched on something which was worrying me before is, when we think about who are the people who aren't in the room and whether they actually even have the capacity or ability, or I shouldn't say capacity, the opportunity to actually be involved in this thinking and addressing it as a problem which we're thinking about at a very high level, when some of them are looking at survival. Many are looking at day-to-day survival. So within the room, we're not sure how we're actually going to tap into that knowledge base, lived experience. What does it mean for them? I can understand why we're having the discussion here, but I'm thinking about the bottom 3 billion or whatever. Where is their reality? How do we as futurists add something to that in terms of what's the next step or opportunities for that? I don't know what the steps are. I'm feeling, you said step into the uncomfortableness, John. I'm uncomfortable, but I'm not exactly sure what the next step, even from me, might be. So I'm just throwing that back in. That's just where I'm at the moment.
It's a huge problem that Sheila's absolutely quite right, that it's a huge problem because of the distractions we have, or the narrative. It's back to the language. The narrative is so dominant to tell us to look in this direction and don't look in any other direction. And the assumption is that the leaders will solve this problem, governments and corporations. Whereas in fact, we know from systems theory, from complex systems theory, that any real transformative change comes from the grassroots. It has to. But the problem, I think, at the moment is that the grassroots can't see and feel that. There's a sense that there's a lot going wrong and that it's not right, but there's no sense anywhere except little shards of light that happen to appear through people like Greta Thunberg, for example, that would indicate there are different ways of approaching this problem. It may be, of course, that we have to get to the stage, human beings are notorious for leaving things, a long time in terms of conflict, in terms of the current pandemic, for example. It was left too long to execute a strategy that would actually work and prevent the global economy from a collapse. I mean, if you look at the situation that even today, there is nobody coming out saying we could have said, just take more vitamin D and that will boost your natural immunity. That might help prevent getting infected by COVID-19, but we didn't. We focused on one thing. And I think it's the distractions telling us to look over there rather than deal with the actual issue. That's one of the problems.
So I think what we're missing here is understanding how the system actually works, a system of propaganda that directs those distractions. These are very carefully designed things that, for example, we're talking about the vaccine, then people who are involved in intellectual property in the medical field who are controlling that propaganda, and they have a lot of resources to do that. That is how we get distracted, etc. And when we don't understand how this system works, then we are constantly trying to look at how we might be able to change the system, when the fact is we cannot. That is the way that it is designed. It is designed such that we are not able to touch it. We are not able to ask the ruling class to look at the systemic oppression that is inflicting on the bottom half of the global human population. And here's where I want to talk about the idea of the ecotone. This is something that comes up a lot in regeneration and biomimicry. It's a highly overused and misappropriated concept. But I want to point to it in the sense that the ecotone is a place where there are 2 different or 3 or 4 different types of habitats that overlap and interact due to geography, climate, a keystone species that does the overlapping, etc. It's a place that is transitory. It doesn't have a boundary. It's a transit space between ecosystems. And here is where you find the grassroots. Here is where you find the local biodiversity hotspots. Here is where you find the innovations, the mutations, the evolutions, etc. If you speak to COVID as a little living organism, it'll tell you the same thing. We find it in the weird genetic oddities in the human race that enables us to evolve. And I guess in futures, there's also this talk about bringing the fringes to the core, right? That's essentially the cycle. So it's this cycle of renewal that I'm talking about that comes from the fringes. And when we are stuck in status quo, this cycle is obviously halted. Those that hold centralized decision-making and influential power are investing all of their effort in maintaining status quo. And the health of entire ecosystems deteriorate because of this. This is the thing that we are talking about when we say it's lacking flavor. So often when we try to define systems, we are trying to agree on what, like all of us have to agree on one definition of what the system is. That's basically what we're doing when we ask questions such as, so what is a solution? We have to first understand the system within which we are talking about and where is that edge. But I bring up the ecotone because there is no edge, there is no boundary. So who are you talking about when you are suddenly defining the marginalized in a particular system? For example, this is where I talk about smart design as being able to define these ecosystems from the perspectives of the most marginalized in society. So there's an iterative thing going on there when it comes to that definition. Architects, for example, often marvel at their own power to literally draw a line and have an entire industry manifest their creation, right? This is exactly what we're talking about. Who is drawing that line? Why is it drawn in that way? Whose perspectives does it come from? And how can we undo that kind of learning, that kind of thinking, that kind of ego? And really, we're doing this, it's not to save anyone, right? This is not to save anyone. We're doing all of this to save ourselves. This is about unlocking human potential in order to save myself so that I can feel as though it's worth living on this planet. That's all.
So the question about, I think, who we're saving, of course, goes back to this, broader question around, who's in the kitchen, who's at the table, and I think Sheila and others have pointed out, how is it that we bring this back down to a level that's, quote, digestible? And so the example of, or really the framing, I think that it maybe is worth holding as we move forward. And there's some great points in the chat around sort of the ethical nature. Are we talking about forethought versus foresight? How do we bring this back down to a level that does seem fundamentally digestible? I suppose I would come back to this sort of framing around, how are you as individuals, as professionals, as folks, of course, engaged in helping others think about the future in different ways? How are you changing what and how you eat? How are you changing what and how you cook? Fundamentally, I'm asking, how do climate change futures affect you at a personal level? How are you staying human in this age of anthropogenic climate change? How is it that you are finding ways of navigating clearly what is something that is existential at a variety of different ways, and when we confront the potentiality and the realization of the kinds of suffering and clearly the need that is continuing to exist and be exacerbated across a variety of different futures, what does that mean and look like for you? as folks, of course, that are not just thinking about themselves, but also clearly in a variety of ways looking to empathize and looking to engage more broadly in the plight of others.
I'll offer something because I'm the oldest in the group. So in a way, it's been easier for me, having lived my life, and I've always had to pivot. The onset of the pandemic, for example, as my public speaking collapsed and it just disappeared. So I have to find different ways of earning income. But in terms of climate, one of the things we started doing immediately, just for us as a family, was to decide that we had to produce our own food as much as possible, that food had to be as organic as possible, that we needed to become as self-sufficient as possible. But also in our village, which is in the far northeast of Thailand, we wanted to make sure that the community around us, which is quite small, understood why we were doing certain things, why we were changing the kinds of rice we were growing to more organic forms of rice, why we were doing things differently, why we were using permaculture to rotate different crops, for example. So I think there are many things you can do. And we were doing that primarily because of our consciousness around this problem of the immediate problem of heating and how we can actually withdraw from the industrial ag paradigm and buy processed food and all of that kind of thing. And we could, for ourselves at least, remedy that in a very small way. And I think if everyone does that at scale, of course, that helps enormously, but it's getting that message across at scale that's the problem. When the media is controlled, by the people who want to maintain the status quo. If you look at the industrial agriculture, if you look at the 5 companies like Cargill's and Fonterra, I mean, the top 5, more emissions come from those companies through industrial agriculture than through the major energy companies like Shell, BP, Exxon. So it's how we get the message across at all levels of society, I think.
Yeah, well, I certainly haven't made the sorts of changes that Richard's talked about. Yeah, there've been some dietary changes, and I've got solar panels on the roof. I'd love to have an electric car, etc. But they're really very at the edge, and I'm guilty in so many ways. My daughters, are vegetarian, and they have made some very ethical choices around stuff, which I think they do better and much more consciously and clearly than I do. And I think it's, in a way, I feel that I might be the oldest on the panel, but I'm still up that end. And I feel that the people who should need to be in the kitchen, and I saw a comment in there about resets and actually in the chat box and wanting, really it's a new way. I'm almost feeling like it's time for me to be right out of the kitchen and for young voices to be taking over and running the thinking in the next phase without any of my potentially long-term bias, which are very difficult to overcome in terms of how long I've been in the system. So I want to give something in space, and I'm happy for that to happen. In a way, as a person in Australia who's going to have, a superannuation pension, etc., I'm hooked on what I talked about with this growth in any case. Even if I change my practices, my income in the future is still, some of it's going to come from stuff which I don't have control over. And it's going to contribute to the same issues that I'm talking about in terms of climate change. Am I going to say, well, gee, I'm going to give all that, I'm just going to, actually, some of it I can't even change. It's locked in. It's like the climate change, which is locked in now in terms of what we're doing. Some of the things which I've bought into in the last 20, my working life are locked in too. I can't really remove some of those because I'm getting something which is going to keep coming to me until I die. but it's going to be part of the problem. So I acknowledge that, but I'm not solving that, and I'm actually not in a position to remove that totally. So there's also a sense of guilt about lifestyles, and I'm sure I'm not alone on the planet. Not everybody's going to be moving to the sort of pure subsistence, or more fundamentally, smaller footprint, which is required before I die. So there's a guilt there.
John, I haven't been watching the chat quite deliberately because, again, sometimes the chat is very illuminating but can be distracting at the same time. But I do think that the cycles that Peter has referred to, and I often refer to the cycle of desire and consumption, which we're all locked into, and the aspiration is global, that Thailand wants to become in the club of that cycle, and we can't get off that cycle. It seems that, and there's no one left. It's like a giant Ferris wheel that goes round and round and round, and there's no one left on the ground to apply the brakes any longer. We're looking for economic growth and economic development, and everything is geared to producing more and more and more production of manufactured goods. And the whole issue of regenerative practice and, yes, reset and the great transitions is all very well if it's coming from the younger generation, because they will see those terms and that language differently than my generation, who are using that language as an excuse to reframe or try to reframe our thinking that this cycle is good and we need to continue with it. We shouldn't trust those words, those phrases coming from capitalists and industrialists who've been, of my generation particularly, who've been responsible for creating the system. That's where my guilt is.
John, I would like to share about my experience. I was a vegetarian for 17 years before I became vegan 6 years ago, and my decision to become vegan was largely influenced by working in the climate space. And when I became vegan, I was exposed to this other movement called the animal rights movement, and I saw how it is very closely interlinked to climate change, as Richard has mentioned a while ago. What I saw here is that a certain cause is not just separated from another. Samantha has been saying, yes, this is systemic, and it is, but the discomfort is, where do I find myself in this space, and what can I do in my own capacity? Because as an activist, as a long-time activist, it's quite frustrating if you are, like always going to the streets and saying these things. Nobody seems to be listening, and it seems to be quite frustrating, even depressing at times. So I came to a point wherein the discomfort is, yes, I know the importance of collective action, but when I am faced with these moments when I feel really, really helpless, I just look at what am I actually able to do. And this is what I tell people, we cannot take on the problem ourselves. We are not the ones responsible for it, but we are part of the problem, and we are also part of the solution. So I think it's really important to empower the youth, the fence line communities, the frontline workers. They are the ones who are, all of the things that we are talking about, they are the ones experiencing it in their day-to-day life. And if we are going to approach them and we are not presenting them with with a whole package of solutions, they might mistrust us. They might think, okay, you're saying this, but then you are doing that. So it has to be really kind of aligned with what you are doing. And so as Peter said, there is some guilt here, and I think we all have that kind of guilt. The mere fact that we are here means we are privileged to talk about these things, and a lot of people are not able to. So how are we providing that space for people to speak out and be part of the solution? Without, of course, I will always say this, without, of course, glossing over it and forgetting about the polluters that we really need to wake up.
I agree with Sheila. Part of the problem again goes back to how we think, and in the West at least, we're so ingrained. The Western cosmology really very early on adopted this dualism, Cartesian logic, and we see, a dual battle at the moment between the grassroots who are feeling this way and the so-called incumbent leaders, so-called leaders in society who want to maintain the status quo. And Samantha is quite right in what she said originally, which is any system can only, any human manufactured design system can only ever produce what it's designed to produce. And so until we acknowledge that fact and can come to terms with the fact that we actually need to redesign the system and the intentions of that system, then we get nowhere. The system will keep on replicating.
Life is fun when white men agree with you and say what you're saying in ways that sound good to other white men. I think the work that is worth doing is unlearning. I think the work that is worth doing is decolonization. And by that, I mean a lot of different things. Decolonization is not an intellectual endeavor that you publish academic papers on. It is a practical lifestyle choice. You can decolonize yourself. You can decolonize your team. You can decolonize your institution. You can decolonize your country. Papua New Guinea is doing that, actually. India is doing that, actually. Bangladesh is doing that, actually. Pakistan is doing that, actually. And that is on a very personal, individual level, where for some people, it's also a very spiritual, religious thing. And for other people, it's it's to literally break down in an Excel spreadsheet, like where does my money go and how do I decolonize the way that I exist financially. And there's a lot in that movement, but essentially that's the only work that I see as important. And so what I've done, I talked about the 3 projects that I'm involved in at the moment. It's all centered in a sort of almost anti-colonization or anti-civilizational perspective of what sustainability could mean. And I don't see why I should help the patient notice that it is sick. I think the patient is dead. There's a few heartbeats left, but I don't need to try to convince the patient that it's sick when it's already dying. I think I'm interested in understanding how to bury the patient within my own mind, to let go of them already before they're dead, and to figure out what new things are birthing and to be part of that. That's all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I think, we titled this session The Pressure Cooker for a reason. And to bring it back to this metaphor, it's actually that intensity that produces quite a lot of flavor and quite a lot of, let's say, texture for, let's say, if you really want that sort of outcome. So my hope is that the pressure and the intensity and being able to touch on the, I think, deeply existential aspects of this lead into the kinds of flavors and the kinds of recipes that we can, hopefully feel some comfort with. And I guess that's a question also that I wanted to come back to. You know, there's of course the sort of often quoted phrase, and there's no atheists in foxholes. So if we do feel that we are able to have the opportunity for belief, and there was a really great project, and there have been lots of projects mentioned in the chat. I wanted to call attention to one, the idea of a good Anthropocene, and the opportunity to seed hope or belief that a good Anthropocene is not just a possibility, but a potentiality. What would that really be for you with regard to being able to seed that as an ingredient? And what is it that you believe that we may be able to share with others for that good Anthropocene?
For me personally, falling sperm counts from 1970-ish will result in a collapse of the human population, perhaps to between 1 and 2 billion people by the end of the century. We're too fecund.
That's a very quick decrease. I hope you're right, Richard. But that is part of the problem, which is not talked about, of course, is
population.
Yeah. And I'm not sure where that fits into the discussion that Samantha was having about the patient. You know, the patient that's dead. There seem to be some things which we'd like to be changing faster than they are. Maybe I'm missing the point about some of the patient, but maybe if you want to comment on that, Samantha, Sam.
Yeah, so the patient is our entire civilization. Everyone who participates in our civilization, including myself, I would like to kill that patient within me so that I no longer feed it because it's dead, zombie. But on the point of population, I think I believe that number that Richard, you mentioned, because it's also about choice. Millennials are not having children, neither will Gen Z. So regardless of sperm count, I think we're going to get there in any case.
Yeah, our recent modeling at the Center for the Future indicates when you take into account everything in terms of population, in terms of the forced stuff, refugees from the climate crisis, for example, and declining sperm counts, and the choice of especially more women that are educated, more women in Africa that receive education, use of contraceptives, I think that's becoming quite realistic.
If I could add just one quick thing, I think what's important is the population in the global north, not the population in the global south. If we consider that the global north is the source of all this consumption, then we have to be really careful about which population we're talking about in terms of decline and how their lifestyles are going to actually be. So I agree with you, Richard, there.
Yeah, the problem with that is, sorry, just one very quick point. The problem with that, and I agree with you, is that it's likely that the wealthy, the ultra wealthy, are going to have it easier. And for me, every billionaire is a policy error. So, you know, it's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm also quite careful when we talk about population, because the tendency is to look at the global south as, you know, the one that we have to, you know, cure in terms of the population problem. But then this is another transferring of responsibility to people who are not actually contributing too much, contributing very, very little to the climate crisis. And so I think the population issue should be the last thing we should talk about if we are going to talk about the climate crisis. Let's talk about industrial animal agriculture. Let's talk about how what I would call obsolete technologies are being brought to the global south. Like in the Philippines, you know, what you are canceling in the United States are being brought to us, these coal-fired power plants. And this is the things that we should really talk about. And these things are actually things that we could directly address. when we talk about population, we have to talk about the education of women. It would take a couple of generations, I think. I'm glad that the millennials, at least the ones that are quite aware and have access to social media, they are understanding that each child is is a potential emitter. But then let's not go there. Let's look at the issues first. I really don't think that population is the issue here. As Samantha said, it is the issue is the consumption and the really negligible consumption in Africa and a lot of places in Southeast Asia.
I don't think you can ignore it. I think it has to be on the table. It's part of the bigger picture. I saw the issue around separations of North and South in the chat box, and I'm not actually talking about North or South. I'm just saying consumption over the whole planet. And the reality is that consumption and the desires will increase the footprint of the planet. We're already at, how many planets do we need currently? And yeah, I'm guilty. I'm in the very privileged class. The decrease in population that's happening in a number of countries is happening in, Italy, Japan, etc. They're the ones which are already experiencing this because of changes. But I understand what you're saying about consumption, Sheila, but somebody's already put it up there. You just have to have it in the equation. You can't ignore it, in my view.
Well, population has been the elephant in the room for such a long time. Nobody wants to talk about it.
Well, it's got some baggage.
Well, I want to. No, go ahead, Peter. Sorry.
No. I mean, it's in some cases it's taboo. It's very difficult, but it should be on the table. Back to you, John.
It's increasingly on the table in terms of AI, because one of the topics within AI now, you could say, is an acceptable eugenics, an approach to acceptable eugenics in terms of creating a purer society, and that's coming from the global north as well.
Wow. Okay, so that's a set of ingredients and a recipe that certainly I think moves us into a space to see the kinds of divisions or at least the differences that emerge, at least in how we begin to think about entering the kitchen and the ingredients. And actually, there was a really interesting paper that was published as a thought piece a few years ago that said, what if we bioengineered humans to be smaller, or what if we enhanced empathy with a variety of technologies, biotech or genetic tech, and is that something? And again, that was a thought piece, right? That was published as an ethics paper, pointing out the kinds of different ways with which conversations are had, or sort of techno solutions are sort of proffered and put forward. I guess I do want to come back to this question around sort of hope and belief and feeling like there's a chance to either sit at the table or realize others are at the table, or feel like there are folks in the kitchen who are able to create something. And I want to take it back to that feeling of, okay, if we go with the metaphor, we're at the restaurant and we've just ordered, and maybe it's a new restaurant and maybe it's a new dish, and we have that sense of hope, we have that sense of belief, there's that sense of longing that, okay, this is going to satiate me, and of course, the best feeling is when we're at a table with those that we care about and love, and we're able to share food together. And so what is it that gives you that sense? What is it about where we are and where we're headed and what's possible, again, what we think that we might like to see that maybe gives us that feeling? Because I think the guilt has come through, and I can't do enough to scrub the blood off my own hands. So how is it that we feel better about the kinds of the kinds of longing for futures that we want to see that are preferred, and certainly for those that we care about immediately, but also that going back to that sense of empathy more broadly?
For me, sorry to keep jumping in, but for me, one of the critical things in transcending that gridlock I talked about, that threshold humanity seems to have reached earlier, has been what I'm doing at the moment, which is trying to create better sense-making tools so that more people could be aware and join in this kind of conversation, and that the redesign of systems that are failing humanity as a whole can be redesigned. So for me, that's where my particular focus is.
Sam or Sheila, please.
Yeah, for me, I'd really, because I'm taking care of myself right now, I don't really want to be stressed with all of these things that I have allowed myself to be stressed for a long time. I don't have the capacity right now to, do the activism that I was doing before. But I think one thing that is really important is to focus on just transition. If we allow people the spaces wherein they can collaborate and they can really, be creative and innovative about solutions that they can actually do, they are actually empowering themselves. And once they have found that power, they will be able to voice out, against the polluters. So if we are not focusing on the solutions right now, if we're still focused on the problem, that itself is, like sort of a positive feedback loop for the problem. So I think it's the time for solutions, the time to empower people to make their own solutions, give them the resources to have their ideas happen, and support the fence line communities. What are their concerns? They will be able to tell us what is really happening, and it will, kind of go beyond the theoretical thinking that is almost always in these discussions.
Bayo Kamalafe says, times are urgent, let us slow down. If we proceed again with the same thinking, we're going to get to the same place, and I'm not interested in that world. So that would just make me very bored, even if I have access to Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. But I think what we each need to look for are the ways that we can exist in our crumbling civilization, and whatever rationale that we can have in our minds to kind of seek that peace, whichever, I don't know, side you stand on, whatever perspective you take. One thing that is very clear is that this is not about empowering anyone. This is about co-liberation. The thing about our civilization is it has given us many ills. It has given us a lot of layers of separation between people, between communities, between the rich and poor, etc. And when we think about how we are trying to undo that, we also need to think about how we are doing that. We are perpetuating that. So the concept of co-liberation is obviously not new. This is from the Black liberation movement that started in South Africa way back. And it is something that we need to reinvigorate or apply when we are talking about guilt, privilege, hierarchy, our positions in, decision-making power internationally, etc. Co-liberation is what we're talking about. We need to empower ourselves to co-liberate ourselves. That's all. That's the only work that is systemic, I think, that is actually needed, and that is under decolonization. That's what it is. There is no sense of supremacy in that co-liberation concept. There is also no sense of ego, because you have to admit that you are flawed as well. Yeah, that's all I wanted to add there.
Yeah, so in the closing minutes, where we only have a little bit of time left, and I think actually to the credit of all of those contributing on the chat, some have said, wait a second, what was that? What was the last hour? What did we do? Was the pressure cooker the right medium? I would like to move to this space to be able to reframe In the spirit of narrative foresight, we often look at shifting the narrative so that we can look towards new options and new possibilities. So the narrative shift that I'd like to offer up, and I'd also quickly ask each of the panelists to offer up, is what is that transition? What does that shifted narrative look like? So mine would be from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids to Honey, I Shrunk My Privilege. So how can we think about reframing this narrative? What's a new narrative, a new metaphor that you think we need to lean into?
Well, mine is Mad Max Fury Road.
Sorry, can you say that again, Sam?
Mad Max Fury Road. You would love that.
Mad Max. Okay.
I would say from Master Chef to Community Kitchen.
Oh, John, my mind's gone blank. I can't compete.
Yeah, I don't have one that's clear, but I'm feeling like something around treading lightly on the earth with love or something. It's much more connected, it's got to be from a place which is, and I take Sam's point about the ego. It's just this, if I could, the conversations are great and I can listen and hear that, but I actually want to feel the earth and experience in a different way, so that love is more real. I think that could change a lot of the way I interact with other things I do.
Thanks, everyone. I do want to call attention to the realness of the feeling and the humility and the humor and the humanity with which each of you have responded and engaged on this very difficult and challenging topic. So again, to commend each of you for being present in this moment and leaning into, again, what is a challenging and a difficult conversation and was intended as such. So yeah, I just want to say thanks to everyone. And Jost, I think we're at time, so we'll toss it back to you.
Yeah.